Today we're going to briefly discuss the early part of British politics during the 19th century as a way to introduce the material that you'll be covering in your articles that you're reading for this week. If we take a moment and look at the image here, this is called the British Constitution 1819, and you'll notice that by constitution it's referring to the health in like your personal, your physical constitution, and you see that the skeleton is being besieged by arrows of things like lost liberties, the Corn Laws, and other sorts of things. And this is going to be kind of the theme of this early period, as you're going to have, like you're seeing in France and elsewhere, a kind of rising of public desire for more freedom and more representation that is going to be quashed by a repressive government in place. Now, for many, we're familiar with the concept of kind of the basic principles of British government, but it might be a good time to review kind of the structure of how it's set up. The British, of course, is a constitutional monarchy. The British government is based on an agreement between the Parliament and the monarch that goes back to the Magna Carta. And so this kind of relationship between an elected body and an appointed body. So the British Parliament consists of a House of Lords, oftentimes referred to as the peerage. These are the people whose seats are inherited. And then the House of Commons, which was don't get too caught up on that name, because the House of Commons, many people in the Commons had titles. These were elected positions, but these were elected elites, and it was really a limited group of people, not too far removed from the House of Lords. Now, to form a government, what would happen would be that following a parliamentary election, the Crown, as they do today, invites the dominant party, the majority party, to form a government. So the Prime Minister is representative of the major party, and he, at this time, would select his cabinet of ministers based on the recommendations from within his own party. And the cabinet of ministers would include like the foreign secretary, the exchequer, that's head of the treasury, the home office, things like that. During this time period, we have two political parties. The Tory party, oftentimes we'll call them plural, the Tories. This was the Conservative Party. And the Whig Party. The Whigs were the more liberal party in terms of reflecting the liberal policies that we've been talking about throughout the 19th century. One of the early concerns that's going to arrive is going to be surrounding the Corn Bill, the Corn Laws. And this was a cartoon, a satirical piece, kind of showing some of the tensions over these corn laws. And if you can see it, you have the landed British gentry pushing away a boat full of foreign corn. So we begin this period, again, going back to the turmoil at the beginning of the 19th century. The Tories are in control. So the Conservative Tory party is in control. And this is led by Prime Minister Lord Liverpool. And his cabinet includes people like Viscount Casterly and others. And we've already met Viscount Casterly at the Congress of Vienna. One of the things that the Tories do, and it's not very unique for the time period, but it is an extension of some earlier laws. They pass these things called the Corn Laws. Now, corn refers to all grain products. So it's not just corn, like corn on the cob. We're talking about cereal grains, oats, anything along those lines, what you make bread from. And the party will pass what are called the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws, very simply, create an artificial price on grain. Now, the purpose of this is because with the end of warfare on the continent, there's the risk of imported grains coming in, and in the free market or unfree market in our sense, these grains would challenge the prices of British corn. So basically, it would drive down the prices that the people growing the agricultural commodities would get. Now, the corn laws will create an artificial means of keeping the price of wheat high. So it's directly to benefit the landed elites, the older landholding aristocracy who owns the land. It basically protects them because the increased and set kind of price for grains ensures that they will be earning their money. But the offset is that it raises the price of bread. So it protects one group, but by virtue of preventing an open market, it creates problems for people who have to buy the bread. Now, as part of this reactionary politics, we're also going to see this time period with these corn laws will lead to protests, particularly amongst the poor and those who are infected in the cities. And this will subsequently, from these protests, again during this reactionary period that we've seen elsewhere, there will be the reinstitution of the Coercion Acts. And the Coercion Acts will suspend habeas corpus for the first time in English history, provides for the arbitrary arrest and punishment and of people who were rioting or protesting the price of corn. And it also will start to crack down on public meetings. And again, this is, we've seen this in France, we've seen this in Germany, so it's not that surprising to also see it in England, although with England's more liberal traditions, it is something unusual. Now, one of the events that's going to come out of this, and it's going to be a tragedy, is called the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. And basically, the Peterloo Massacre occurs in Manchester, and it's a demonstration against the Corn Laws, and it's one of these demonstrations that's also beginning to demand basically more access to Parliament. There was this call for increasing the electorate, and the idea being that this would help address some of these issues with these laws. And this Manchester protest consists of about 50,000 people, and it's a relatively well-disciplined protest. And I think that's what was so disconcerting to the city elders there in Manchester. So they sent in this group called the Yeomen, and these were kind of like your local, imagine if the Chamber of Commerce had a paramilitary group. They go in to kind of rough up people and tell them to disperse their crowd. And these Yeomen, of course, just end up angering the crowd, and so they get trapped in this group of 50,000 people. And so subsequently, the actual military, the hussars, are called in, and these are hardened, veterans coming off of, the defeat of the Napoleonic armies in Europe, and it's 700 people or so are injured. I think about not as many are killed as what they originally thought, but it's really kind of a horrific, bloody repression of this otherwise peaceful protest. And so this Peterloo Massacre, as it's come to known, is really kind of the turning point for, again, more of this oppressive response. And Parliament will pass the 6 Acts. And again, these eventually will be all overturned later on and repealed, but they're really kind of indicative of what's happening during this time period. There is amongst these 6 acts, there's one called the Training Prevention Act, which prevents civilians from being trained in the use of weapons. And all of these are kind of focused on, ferreting out and limiting the the effect of these agent provocateurs. There's the Seizure of Arms Act, and it allows local authorities to go in and search people's homes for weapons. There's the Seditious Meetings Act. Basically, it's meetings that are called to uh, grieve over any matter about the church or state. You can't have those unless you fill out all these forms and things. The blasphemous and seditious libel acts. Really, these were extreme. If you were printing libelous materials, basically, if you're printing protest materials, you could get these up to 14 years transportation. They would send you to Australia, basically. And these will this one actually wasn't enforced that regularly because it was such an affront to free speech. The Misdemeanors Act, it will speed up the mechanisms of the courts so that you can prosecute protesters more effectively. And another Newspaper and Stamp Duties Act, which adds additional taxes on printed materials so as to undermine the legitimate press, and which most of the radical publications just simply went to underground and they weren't paying any taxes. But that's the reaction to Peterloo. Um, Things just get worse, and it's not so much that the liberals or those that are seeking protesting, asking for kind of these moderate reforms. I mean, they're being infiltrated by radicals, and one of these groups called the Cato Street Conspiracy. Um, this is led up by these Spencerian philanthropists, they call themselves, and the Cato Street Conspiracy's leader is named Thistlewood, and Thistlewood comes up with his idea in 1820 to overthrow the government and set up a committee of public safety to supervise a radical French modeled revolution in Britain. Why 1820? Because George III, the king, which you may remember from your American history courses, he dies. And this causes a constitutional crisis because of his line of succession wasn't very clear, and always when you change the monarch, you have an election and you change parliament, and it basically is just parliamentary elections. The conspiracy, they decide that they're going to seize this crisis moment and kill the entire cabinet of Liverpool. So they see an advertisement in the newspaper. Now, this should tell you something about this conspiracy. They see this advertisement in the newspaper that there's going to be a grand cabinet dinner, and it even has the address of, where in Grosvenor Square and all that sort of thing. And so the idea was, well, look, here's a perfect place to do that. Thistlewood suggests that he would, pretend to be a messenger, go to the door, and then everybody would run in, seize the servants, hold them with a gun, and threaten them with death if they had any resistance or noise, and then they would, seal off the stairs, run into where the people are having dinner, and chop off their heads. It was a very elaborate plan and very bloody at that. And then they also planned to take the heads of Castlereagh and another minister named Sidmouth and put them in bags so that they could be put onto pikes and displayed at Westminster Bridge. However, the person who had infiltrated the conspiracy group and placed the advertisement in the Times was an agent of the government. So the conspirators were arrested at their last meeting prior to calling out their plan, and put on trial. And as you can see in the photo, they were set to be executed. And I have here my erroneous things I just noticed in my slide. It wasn't to blow up the entire cabinet, it was to kill the entire cabinet. There were no bombs involved this time. If you think back to the Guy Fawkes plot, that was when they were going to blow things up. But nonetheless, the conspirators' plan to kill the cabinet didn't go through. The ringleaders were executed, and additional people, there were 5 others that were sent to Australia. And in retrospect, this is how the government uses to justify maintaining the 6 acts. Basically saying, see, if we hadn't had the 6 acts in place, we wouldn't have had the mechanism to find out about this conspiracy and save the day. Now, there's going to be a great deal of crises brewing within the Tory party over this sort of thing, because the older Tories, and again, we see this generational issue, the older Tories think that this is perfectly a fine way to do things. And you're going to see much more oppressive angles taken by people like Wellington, who you're going to read about this weekend. And this is going to lead to some fractures. And these fractures are going to actually undermine the Tory party's ability to maintain control. That I'm going to leave for you to read about in our other assignment, but I want to kind of set us up for where we're going with the Great Reform. So throughout the 1820s, the goal was, and this really kind of starts with kind of a rational approach to it. The problem is that you have these laws, such as the Corn Laws, and they're being made by people who do not represent the entire population. So if you really want to fix things, the best route to go is through parliamentary reform. You change the composition of the House of Commons so that it is more reflective of all the people who live in the United Kingdom. And so increase the electorate so that you are bringing people in from that truly represent the interests of the populace. Then also the idea of the original lines for these parliamentary districts or these boroughs are medieval in their origin. So some of them, you would have places with 7, 8 people sending a member to parliament. These were called rotten boroughs. Or the local election laws were such that, basically one family controlled everything. And so the question was to reform those rotten boroughs, identify them, and get rid of them. And the other big problem was that you had these huge new industrial centers such as Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool. They had next to no representation because they didn't exist when the original lines were drawn. And so you had a huge population in these areas that had no representation in Parliament simply because they had recently become metropolitan areas. So and it's a very rational, very easy to kind of understand strategy for moving towards a very moderate style of reform. Now, again, I'm skipping over the Catholic emancipation issue because you're going to read about that on your own. But in 1830, as King George IV had died, that's who had succeeded King George III. In 1830, he dies, and he's ascended by King William IV, who is, I think, a nephew of King George III. And King William IV, again, a new king, new parliamentary elections. And because the Whigs, because the Tories had been, kind of fractured, and, Wellington was up there giving his speeches on, I'm not reforming anything, the Tories kind of shot themselves in the foot. And so you see this tremendous Whig victory. And so William IV asks the Prime Minister, Earl Grey, to form a cabinet, form a government, and immediately they introduce reform legislation. And it's basically to address these issues we saw earlier. It's a struggle to get it through. And you're going to, like I said, I don't want to spoil the story too much for you because you're going to read about this in detail, but it's able to get through the Commons, but remember there's always a second house. And the House of Lords, they're not going to budge. And so it ultimately will take several times to get the legislation approved by the House of Lords, and even the king threatening to create more seats amongst the peerage to shift the balance over to getting this measure passed. And the Great Reform is kind of it's the way that we're going to keep revolution from transpiring, because the concern is looking at what's happening in France and elsewhere, Belgium. You don't want that in England, and so this is a moderate way to appease everyone, introduce some liberal reforms without going all in towards universal suffrage, because it does not. I mean, the Great Reform addressed enfranchisement, disenfranchisement, and added some qualifications. By disenfranchisement, the Reform Act basically gets rid of 56 of these rotten boroughs. And so there are 56 boroughs, 56 areas that had 111 representatives being nominated. I mean, these were garbage seats, and they were terribly corrupt. So it gets rid of them. There are 30 boroughs that have fewer than 4,000 inhabitants. Each one of them will lose one of their representatives. And Weymouth and Melcombe Regis are two places that have next minimal populations, and between the two of them, they have 4 members of parliament, and these places will, lose half of their representatives. Now, that opens up these extra seats. The enfranchisement part provides 65 seats to counties, and 44 will be distributed to these new large towns like Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, and the metropolitan districts around London that basically had 0 representation. There will be 21 smaller towns given 1 MP each. Scotland gets 8 additional seats, and Ireland ends up with 5 additional seats. And so it is, spreading out the, at least the representation. For the franchisement, realize that it's going to big part in with the Great Reform is it regularizes it. It keeps it from, being just higgledy-piggledy wherever you live. These are the rules. It sets a specific qualification, and basically, the right of voting was vested in people who pay a yearly rental of £10, which was quite a substantial amount of money. And if you did not own your house, you had to be also paying at least £10 in rent. The end result is that it really only, but this is radical in its sense, it expands the electorate by 20%. Okay, it adds 20% to the numbers who can vote. It sounds small, but compared to what it was, it is a significant gain. And so that's kind of just a very cursory overview of the Great Reform, but I felt it was necessary that you kind of had this overview prior to your readings, because they'll make more sense now, just kind of with what was going on, who are these names, and that way, as you're filling in the gaps, it's not just you're missing some information. So I just wanted to get this out there so that you would have this. And again, if you have questions, let me know. But this was just kind of a quick and dirty approach to the early part of British politics in the 19th century, and I hope it helps.